Now, Manchester City will know by the end of the month if they'll face sanctions under UEFA's financial fair play regulations. The club financial control body is meeting to decide which teams across Europe are in breach of rules. Now, Manchester City and Paris Saint-Germain are reported to be the most high-profile clubs likely to be affected. The sports lawyer Daniel Geey has joined us today. Good evening to you. Financial fair play, I've read all about it. It gets very, very confusing. Is it simply that you've got to be able to pay your bills?
More or less. I mean, in basic terms, what we're saying is clubs have to be self-sustaining, their revenues have to equal costs, and for UEFA, FFP compliance purposes at least, they can only make certain losses over the next few years.
I was going to say that I probably could name clubs on one hand who actually can pay all their bills and it all seems self-sustainable. I mean, how much money are they allowed to lose?
From a UEFA perspective anyway, clubs are allowed to lose 45 million euros over an initial two-season period, and then after that first season, then it's over a three-season period.
So as little as that?
So 45 million euros, so long as the club owners are willing to put that money in terms of new shares. So it's a very small amount. And when we're talking about huge amounts like hundreds of millions of pounds being spent on player transfers and wages, it's a narrow element.
My goodness. Why are UEFA doing this then?
I think the primary reason as well is from a European level and on a club domestic level is we've seen club administrations, points deductions, relegations, and the vicious financial circle continues. I think what UEFA is trying to do, in the same way the Premier League and the Football League is doing now as well, is ensuring that there is some greater rationality in club spending, and that in effect what they are bringing in revenues isn't equaling or furthering, lessering from a cost perspective.
Rationality in football. It'll never happen. I'm going to just put up here the world's top paying clubs in terms of average wage. And I cannot believe it. All the American football teams and baseball teams, Manchester City are top. Average weekly pay is £102,653. Wow. And probably no wonder why Manchester City find themselves maybe crossing that line, maybe finding themselves in trouble with UEFA.
Well, I think the first thing to say is, don't you wish we were Man City
players? Yes, I do.
It would be a lot better if we had the talent, unfortunately. But I think from a financial perspective anyway, and from FFP perspective, the biggest cost base effectively for types of costs are wages. And if we're taking this as the way that things are, and £100,000 per wage for their top players on their squads, then that's a significant sum. And Manchester United being 83,000, Chelsea getting within the top 10 amount of figures. The majority of the top Premier League clubs that are competing year on year for the Champions League are having to spend that type of money to compete with the rest of Europe as well. OK,
I've always thought there were ways around this, that the wealthy owner could say, I tell you what, I'll buy a box for £5 billion and then we can get away with it. And there's an illustration here. I think both Paris Saint-Germain and Manchester City are hoping to do that. Is that possible?
From a layman's perspective anyway, the basics are that from accounting principles, there are ways around to ensure that there isn't a way of inflating your revenues in order just to be able to boost it for compliance perspective. So the very traditional way of an owner paying €5 billion for a box in their own stadium for the next 5 years, it's a pretty transparent way of trying to get around the rules. But that's where UEFA has to do its investigation, has to examine whether there are types of sponsorship arrangements that are more likely to be at an inflated price, which then gives the illusion that the revenues are increasing, which allows them to comply with FFP.
Yeah, two examples here with Manchester City and Paris Saint-Germain. OK, Manchester City, Paris Saint-Germain, they've broken the rules. Let's say they have. What possible sanctions could UEFA, I suppose, impose on them? They're not going to fine them, are they?
Well, I think the thing to bear in mind from the first sense is that there are reports today that clubs like PSG and City might be in trouble. We don't know as yet what the outcomes will be, let's say that. But for any club that effectively breaches the FFP sanctions for UEFA, we can look at the sanctions there, going from a warning to a reprimand. Obviously, the ones at the top of that list are the softer sanctions. The ones towards the bottom of that list are obviously the harsher sanctions. And I think the thing that's worth mentioning is that we talk about the €45 million figure. If a club is very close to just on top of that figure, let's say €47 million loss, I think it's more likely that the top end of those sanctions are the ones that are going to be imposed. If, for example, a club is 100 million outside of the 45 million, let's say 150 million euro loss, I think it's more likely that towards the end, the bottom end, the harsher end of those sanctions are the ones that are going to be imposed.
And of course, I suppose clubs will argue and they'll say, oh, we'll appeal. But apparently that sort of process has been sped up as well. Once a decision is made, it's pretty much made.
Exactly. So the first step will be is when UEFA come to their decisions in the coming weeks, the clubs will have a limited amount of time to effectively appeal to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. And after that decision has been made, which will have to be, as we mentioned before, be before those summer months where the Champions League and Europa League competition starts, that will be effectively the final stage for that decision-making process.
All right, interesting few weeks ahead. Dan, Geey, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.